Welcome back to the GenTwenty podcast. I'm Nicole.
And I'm Marina.
And today we're talking about making difficult life decisions. So there will always be hard decisions to make in life, no matter where you are, whether you're in your teenage years, your early 20s, your mid-20s, your late 20s. We're all kind of facing these big, almost like monumental decisions, like if not every day, at least fairly often.
Definitely. And they're never, not to be like a downer, but you're never not going to have hard decisions to make, but you will get better at making them. It comes with time. It comes with being forced to make these decisions, and it comes with practice.
Yeah, and I think over time you also learn a little bit more about what really works for you and what's better for you, and also what's really not working for you.
Absolutely. And like sometimes learning what doesn't work for you is more helpful in the long run because you can kind of cut out the excess. And like I always say, I learn better from my mistakes than my successes because they just seem to stick more.
Yeah, because I think you're like learning big lessons and then which you can apply going forward versus like successes. You're like, okay, this worked, but did it just work this one time? Like, what other factors are going on here? So, yeah, I think when we kind of start facing these hard decisions in life, which I think we definitely face a lot in our 20s, especially because we're making tons of big life changes, like from graduating from college to getting married to choosing jobs, traveling, having kids. There's all these big things that are going on. So we just have a couple of ways to kind of help you through making those big life decisions.
Yeah, and I know that like it can get really overwhelming because it feels like, oh, this one decision is going to affect the rest of my life. And like, yeah, it might, but also that's okay. And I love the phrase wherever you are, there you are, because it's not like there are always going to be black and white, red, black and white, yes or no, or right or wrong. It's going to be, sometimes it's just, this was the best decision for me in the moment, because obviously hindsight shows us so much that we can't anticipate for. But with these kind of 5 tips we have for you, it will really help you feel confident in the decisions you're making in the moment you're making them.
Yeah, exactly. So the first tip that we have is to maintain open and honest communication, especially with your support network. So Marina and I were talking about this a little bit previously, but when you have these people around you who you feel safe bouncing ideas off of and who are also going to give their honest opinion of what decisions you're trying to make, it's really helpful because they can also draw from their experiences to kind of, help guide you or show you things you might not have seen. I know my brother does this with me a lot when he's trying to make big decisions. He'll be like, so this is what I'm thinking. Do you see any holes in this plan?
Yeah, absolutely. When I decided, or when I was thinking about going to grad school, but not quite ready to like announce or decide that I was going to definitely do it, I remember talking to one of my childhood friends who had gone to grad school for something different right after she graduated, whereas I was working full time. And I remember saying like, hey, I'm thinking about going back to school. And I mentioned what I wanted to study. And she just said, finally, this is exactly what you've been meant to be doing. You've talked about it for the last 5 years. And I was like, I didn't even realize I had been talking about it because it was just something I would bring up at random. And then I remember when I told a different person about, oh, I'm going to apply to grad school, their reaction was much different on a more like logical side of like, oh, well, you'll still have to get a job after. And I was like, right. But
Yes, obviously. Thank you so much.
but the grad school will help me do that.
Yeah.
So, it was helpful to get both perspectives because my friends like glowing support bolstered my confidence, but my other friends kind of more not cynical, but more logical perspective was like, yeah. And it affirmed, yeah, I want to do this so that I can get a better job. And I need the schooling to help me do that. And so by using my support network, I got a kind of variety of feedback and it helped me really solidify like, yeah, this is definitely what I want to be doing and what I feel is right for me.
Hey, it's Nicole.
And Marina.
And we're popping in to say that we're launching a product. The Capsule Collab is our curated box with themed collections. Check us out at thecapsulecollab.com and on Instagram at thecapsulecollab. Yeah, I'm glad you said that at the end there because I think one kind of caveat we need to remember with this is that you can't let other people's ideas or their decisions of your life influence you too much. You know, like ultimately, it's still you who's doing the thing, you who is responsible for you. So you need to, like, you know, kind of take their advice, but also with a grain of salt sometimes because, you know, like they might prioritize different things than you do. And so I think it's also important to like keep in mind what you want
Yeah,
instead of like what
absolutely.
they want or what they think is for you, you know?
Right. And that, like, that's a good thing to highlight too. Like, obviously, if you have a good support network, they will want what's best for you, but that might not always align with what you think is best for you. So you are always the final decision maker and you are always the
Mhm.
final say. And like, I know some people just, because a lot of the feedback I got from saying, oh, I'm going to go to school for writing, people would say, well, can't you just do that without going to school for it? And I was like, yeah, but this is what I need. And I knew I was going to do it. Like the more I talked about it and honestly, the more I had to defend it, the more I knew it was right for me. And I think that's why it's so important to talk it out. And you don't have to tell the world, you don't have to get everyone's opinion, but even with like 2 or 3 people, it helps you just kind of round out your idea.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So, the next thing that's super important for all of us to do when we're making big life decisions is to assess your finances. Now, money, as we know, can play a huge role in what we are or aren't able to do. We have a ton of posts on the blog where I've written extensively about, you know, saving money and investing and all those kinds of things where you can start building towards this financial freedom earlier in life where, you know, you don't have to like look at your bank account before making these decisions necessarily. I mean, I still think you should, but it's like your bank account is not dictating your choices.
Yeah. I mean, you want to set yourself up so that your bank account can't dictate your choices, right? When I
Yeah.
was in my like first big girl job after college, I was there for 2 years and kind of early on, like maybe 6 months in, I knew it wasn't going to be like a lifelong job. It wasn't my dream. And it was as the time went on, I really grew to hate it, but I knew in order to have security and stability, I needed to kind of get myself in a good financial position. So I really like scrimped and saved and lived my life in a way that I could have like a safety net. And so when I got to a breaking point, I remember because I think I mentioned I definitely mentioned in a previous episode how I would go to this job and be like, okay, one more day, it's going to be okay. And then every day at the end, I'd be like, I'm going to quit tomorrow. I'm going to quit tomorrow. And I couldn't because I didn't have another job lined up. But in saving and thinking ahead and kind of knowing that in the long term I would want to make changes and saving, I was able to build out that safety net so I could leave my job without another job lined up and still like afford food and rent. And I made very strategic decisions to do that. I left rather than just like quitting one day when I was really furious. I waited a couple of months until I got the bonus at the end of the year and made sure I would have that extra kind of cushion. And I had like mini gigs lined up to walk dogs and things like that so that I would never just be net zero. And I know I have friends, especially if you're living in a big city with a really high cost of living, I have friends who are kind of living month to month or paycheck to paycheck and can't just stop and pivot. And you want to be able to do that if you can or need to.
Yeah, because like didn't after you quit that job, you were still even able to pay your rent until your lease was up for like a few months,
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
while. And because I remember you saying that your friends were like, "How are you paying for this?" And you're like, "Well, I saved my money."
And I saved it for like 3 years. So
Yeah,
it wasn't just 6 months.
like
And
overnight. Yeah.
I think we've talked about this on the blog. Like you don't want to inflate your cost of living. You want to make sure you're living within your means and like honestly below your means if you can, because I lived in New York City. That's a really expensive city and there's tons to do, but I tried my best to take advantage of the opportunities that were like free to you or low cost because I was early 20s. I knew I had a long road ahead of me. I wasn't making a ton at my job, but I wanted to be able to travel and have that safety net. So yeah, I would have friends say like, how can you afford this? And it's like, well, I don't have these like extras. I don't go out to bars very often. I don't go out to eat. I cook a lot. I don't get my nails done or do these, like the little things add up. So I would really be careful on my day-to-day spending because I think
And you
that's
had
what,
a roommate,
and
so
I had two roommates,
mhm.
and it was just, it was something that was really important to me, and I believed that I could do it. So I did it. I think sometimes, especially if we don't have a strong relationship with money growing up, a lot of times it's like, well, that's just something other people know how to do and I'm never going to know it. But for me, I've always been a saver. And so I knew how to save. It was helpful because I knew, like, okay, well, I know I can live my life in a way that I don't need to be spending money to enjoy it. And so
Yeah, so all that to say that this kind of plays into something we're going to go into like in a couple of minutes, but I think when you're thinking about your finances, like living below your means is something I think is really important to do. And I know, like, I mean, I've been in places in life where that felt like nearly impossible to do, but I mean, I've also been in places where it was, relatively easy to do, to make sure that I was paying myself first and building up my savings and stuff. And I think that, like no matter where you are in life, you can always start building that savings habit, whether it's like $5 a paycheck or something like that. I think it is possible personally.
I'm just remembering when you say that, one of the first pieces I wrote for GenTwenty, I had just moved to New York City, and I had, those like just moving to a city costs where I was getting furniture for my apartment. And by furniture, I mean a very cheap IKEA bed frame, and I took a used mattress from my family's house, kind of that kind of situation. So I did this like no spending challenge where, other than like life necessities of food, water, transportation, medicine, whatever, I did not buy anything for 6 months. And it was really hard because in New York and most cities, I think the way you socialize is to go out and meet people at bars or restaurants or to do expensive things together. And a lot of my friends, we were 23. They didn't really understand what I was doing, but it was important to me, and I was on a mission to do it for GenTwenty's article. So that was a hugely helpful exercise, and I still do it from time to time. I I also recommend, I'm interrupting my own story. I recommend having monthly meetings with yourself and your finances. So, like, for me, every month on the 30th, I sit down and look over all my finance. Like, I budget out for the next month, look over all my spending, look at my bank account, double check my checking account, make sure things are where they're supposed to be. And I keep
Hmm.
track of my spending throughout the month by recording it in a spreadsheet, but I have that dedicated kind of check in, which helps me reassess my goals. And so if I noticed, oh, I've spent more than I would have liked, then I kind of put myself on like a no spending limit for another month just to kind of catch up and reassess. It's also a good way to stop hoarding, because sometimes it's like, oh yeah, I want that shirt, and like, oh yeah, I like this purse. So another thing that is really helpful is, before you make a decision, like especially a big one, is to kind of figure out your mental health, figure out how you're feeling. Because I think everyone's heard the phrase, like, never make a decision when you're angry, never make a decision when you're sad, never make a decision when you're stressed, because we're not thinking clearly. So if you think, oh, this is a great job opportunity, I'm going to apply to this job, and if I get it, I'll move across the country. Think about how you're feeling. How will that affect you? Do you feel confident in your ability to do that? Is it the right time? Is it is it going to pull you away from your support network? And if so, are you going to feel confident that you can build up another network locally? Kind of, if you're already anxious about your job and you just want out, but you're afraid of the future of, because you don't have another job lined up, is there something you can do in like baby steps to minimize the anxiety you have at your current job so that you can keep your job and also look for a new job? There's so much to consider, and how we feel about ourselves and our mindsets can drastically influence the way we finalize decisions.
Yeah, I think paying attention to your mental health in general is super important, especially when it comes to making these big life decisions. Because I mean, I've had time periods in my life where I was extremely anxious. Like I've mentioned before, how I did not leave my house alone by myself for 3 years. And I feel like making a big life decision during that incredibly stressful, anxious period of my life would not have served me well in the long run, because I would have been acting out of anxiety and out of fear and not out of a rational idea for like what I needed in my life and what was going to be best for me in the long term.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of times you have to kind of address like your stress, anxiety, or depression first before making big decisions. But I mean, sometimes these things can play a big role in the decisions that you're making. Like if you are, say, you're working this job in New York and you are incredibly stressed all the time, it's, really wearing on you mentally and physically. Like you can tell something's not right. You feel very on edge all the time. Like maybe you've been diagnosed with depression. Like perhaps the best thing in that situation would be for you to leave the situation.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's something to consider as well. Like there's kind of two sides to the coin, but I don't think that necessarily making big life decisions during these like very stressful times is always the right thing to do.
Yeah, I agree. And another aspect of how the decision plays into your mental health is, obviously you want to make a decision in a clear frame of mind. But like Nicole said, if your mental health is affected by something you're doing, and changing or making like the decision you want to make will help that, that's a great thing to do, which I feel like doesn't make sense. So I'll explain with an example. When I was applying to grad school, I applied to schools all over the country, and I got into a school in San Francisco and Los Angeles. And I the two biggest factors that ultimately had me choose one school over the other were my financial and mental health. So San Francisco was much more expensive. The program was more expensive. I didn't know anyone in the city, and I knew that the financial aspect would stress me out a lot more. And then with the Los Angeles program, it was more affordable. I could live at home because my mother lived, she still lives, I live there now. She lives nearby. And so those were a huge factor. And I also realized I was so stressed and anxious from living in New York and having a bad work situation that I needed a safe haven, and moving home was going to both offer me huge financial savings, but also give me a space where I could kind of take a breather and get my head in a good space. And so making decisions that will benefit your mental health are really important. So often I think people don't factor in how is it going to affect me positively or negatively from a mental health perspective. And it's okay to make decisions, to make changes to your life, if not for any other reason than to benefit your health. We had a friend who chose to leave her full-time kind of corporate path because she had a lot of health issues, and working on her own business and being an entrepreneur where she could set her own schedule was going to help benefit her health. And so it's like, you can make those decisions. You can choose to leave the path of normal, quote unquote, normalcy for your happiness and health. Like, that's okay. And if no one ever told you that, I'm telling you that now.
Yes, I completely agree. I think that it's so important to pay attention to how you're responding to your environment and to make changes, in a way that will positively improve your life.
Because I think a lot, especially with career stuff, as we're building our careers, a lot of times we get into jobs that we don't like or don't love, but are fine. And then they deteriorate, and you get desperate to the point where you just make the decision to take any job to get out of it. And that's not a good way to make a big decision, because that will affect your life.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this kind of leads into our next point of where you kind of need to project into the future, and we call it thinking with the end in mind.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes when you're making these decisions, you have to kind of, think 10 to 15 years ahead. Is making this choice going to put you on the path that you want to be on? Is it going to take you further from your goals? Like, how is it impacting your life? And I think one way that I've been thinking about this a lot is like with student loans. I think that when we're presented with student loan options at age like 17, 18, 19, it's like, okay, well, we obviously have to take this because this is obviously how we're paying for school. But it's not really sold to us with the idea that like, oh, you're going to be paying this back in like $500 to $1,000 a month once you graduate. And like, that's such a huge decision to make. You know, like 18-year-old Nicole had no idea what 22-year-old Nicole is going to be doing. And I used to kind of like cry a little bit when I had to make my student loan payments
Mm-hmm.
because I mean, like I did pay my student loans off early, so I did as much as I could to throw as much as I could at them, and that's like something we could do a whole nother episode on. But I think that it's like when I think about it now and like with college students, for example, it's like I mean, student loans are actually very like predatory in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it's just one of those things where you're kind of like, okay, well, this is what I have to do to achieve this. And like, that's not necessarily true, you know? And you're not really thinking like what you'll be doing in like 4, 5, 6 years and how long these student loans are actually going to impact your life.
Yeah. Do you want to be paying loans when you're a parent yourself? I think about that a lot, and sometimes that is the option that we end up with, but that's why it's important to kind of look at a like a 360-degree view of what you want to do. And I think we could talk about the financial situation of colleges in another episode because I have a lot to say about that too. But
Mm-hmm.
I, it's not like, oh, what am I going to have for lunch today? Turkey sandwich. Okay, done and dusted. You're thinking, oh, do I want to move to this city? Do I want to take this career path? Do I want to date this person? These, and if you think, oh, I'm dating someone kind of casually and they're nice, but they don't want children or they don't like children, but I want to have kids. That's something you need to think about because future you will not be happily partnered with someone who doesn't want kids if you want kids. So things like that, which can feel like, oh, that's future me's problem. Like,
But
don't do that.
you
Don't
are,
do that. Yeah, you
yeah,
are future.
you are future you.
Don't hurt yourself like that. Look out for your future you. And
Mm-hmm.
I always say things like that when I even like with little things where I, remember to fill up my water bottle the night before and I'm like, yeah, past me was so nice to current me. Like, look out for
Mm-hmm.
yourself and your happiness.
Yeah, ultimately, like you're gonna be the only person that's doing that, really. So I think that just whatever like big decision you're making, you have to think how this is gonna impact you, you know, 5, 10, 15 years down the road. I mean, maybe even further. It's kind of hard for me to even think that far ahead. But I
Hmm.
think it's in terms of like, you know, how much student loan debt you're taking on or where, you know, you might be, you know, entering a relationship you're not sure about or just things like that. And I think that a lot of our decisions might be altered if we consider what future us might want.
That's definitely true. And I feel like one thing to consider that we haven't talked about is how like lifestyle inflation can affect our decisions because we'll see our friends and our siblings or our peers have that fancy car or just a new car or be in a relationship and you have to remember that we're all on our own timeline and our own path. And so
Mm-hmm.
the decisions you make, you can only you can decide what's right for you. So, I had the option between these two grad schools and one was more prestigious and had a maybe better classes or maybe I'd get a slightly better education, but I could not handle going into debt for that. And for me, it didn't matter to have a name on a degree for a creative writing master's. So I chose to kind of go the more practical, frugal route where, a lot of my friends who went to schools went to really known good schools. And it's like, that's awesome. But that wasn't for me. And that's okay.
Yeah. I think it was Amy Poehler who said, good for you, not for me.
Yes, I was just thinking about that. And that's like a
Yeah.
mantra we should all repeat.
Yeah. And I think that's just important to remember that, like, something that was good for someone else isn't necessarily what's good for you or what is going to be good for you. And it's like we are all on our own timelines and doing things in our own ways. And like we have different budgets and different incomes and different goals. And so there's not really a comparison, you know, like ultimately you have to make the best decisions for you and for future you.
Yeah. And so one more way that you can help yourself with that is something Nicole and I are huge fans of, which is a weighted pro and con list. Nicole, do you want to describe what that is?
Yeah, so basically when you're making your pro-con list, you might put, okay, I'll use an example to help make it more clear. So when my husband and I graduated from college, we weren't married yet at that point. We got married a little bit after college. But he had received a job offer across the country. He also had received one locally. So we were kind of having to decide, like, well, do we want to move across the country or do we want to stay here? And they had different like pros and cons, obviously, but when you're making your list, it's like different things are weighted differently. So one thing that might, like in this situation, be weighted more heavily is that the job further away has like a much larger salary. So that was something to keep in mind. But like something we might have also considered as important was being closer to family. So, I mean, one of those things would be more important than the other. And it's really up to you to decide what that choice would be. And ultimately, our choice was to move across the country, not really because of the money, but because of the career opportunities and the fact that we were young and we did not have children. We didn't really have any like major attachments. We were able to still travel back and forth across the country fairly easily. So we decided that at that point in time, that's what we wanted to do. And that's, that's not something that we might decide now.
Absolutely. And I make pros and cons lists for everything just because that's how my brain works. But the weighted aspect is important because you have to also ask yourself, like, of all these pros or all these cons, what really matters? If it's, well, I don't like the neighborhood, that's going to matter more than I don't like the color of my apartment walls, because you can change the color of your apartment wall, but you can't really just pick up and move out of your neighborhood, and you're going to be there every day and your environment matters. So kind of, again, just asking yourself what really matters to you. What do you really need out of the decision you're trying to make, and kind of go from there.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think especially with pro cons lists, it's really like, I think they're wonderful tools to use, but it's also important to remember that like, just because your pro list is longer, like those things might be less important to you than the things that are on your con side of it. So like, just when you're looking at your list, just evaluate what is most important to you, what is going to most impact you now and you in the future. I think those are both really important things to keep in mind when you're making your pro con list.
Definitely. And also, if you're someone who has anxiety or stresses about making decisions and stresses about the future, just remember that what if is a toxic phrase, and you can't think about the what ifs. You have to think about the opposite of that. So, what if I had gone to the other school? What if I had done this? Maybe, like, that is never going to serve you. You made the decision that was right for you in that moment, and that's how you got to where you are now. If you had made the other decision, you wouldn't be where you are. And so that's okay. It's okay to be exactly where you are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we can't live in a place of what if, because there are really infinite what if possibilities. And it's not fair to do that to yourself. I think you have to use the information that you have to make the best decision for yourself that you can right now. And then, looking back, trust that you made the right decision.
Absolutely. We also have an article that a contributor wrote about this, with including 52 questions to ask yourself. So we're going to include that in the show notes because we could talk about this forever. But ultimately, at the end of the day, just do what is best for you and future you.
This has been another episode of the GenTwenty podcast. Please subscribe and rate and leave a review if you're feeling like it. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you have any episode ideas, please reach out. Bye.